My name is Samantha Waters, and I am 35 years old. Throughout my life, I've often felt overpowered by the assertiveness displayed by some men, sometimes even finding it intimidating. My experiences with romantic relationships have been limited, with very few serious dates to speak of. By the time I reached what society often labels as middle age, my parents grew increasingly worried about my single status and suggested I try arranged dates. Reluctantly, after much resistance, I gave in to their suggestions. There were few opportunities to meet someone in my usual routine, and under the weight of my parents' concerns, I felt the pressure building to find someone and perhaps marry. I agreed to several arranged dates. One of these dates was with Bob, who presented himself as a kind, responsible man and held a prestigious position at a top-tier company. Despite his large frame and height, he didn't come off as intimidating, which was a relief to me. Our discussions about marriage progressed smoothly, and soon, I found myself meeting his parents. Bob's family was deeply rooted in the culinary world, running a traditional cooking school. His father was a renowned master chef. The first time I met Bob's father, his presence was commanding, always dressed in traditional attire that somehow demanded respect and straight posture from those around him. His wife, Bob's mother, contrasted him with her gentle demeanor and warm smile, accentuated by charming dimples. Eventually, Bob and I decided to marry, much to the delight of my parents, who felt I had struck gold. Part of our marriage agreement was that I would leave my job as an administrator at an electronics company to become a full-time housewife. At that moment, my colleagues teased me about marrying up, and looking back, I realized that might have been the peak of my happiness. Bob explained that he was overwhelmed with work and would often be unable to come home, asking for my understanding and patience. He expressed a desire to reach certain professional milestones before eventually joining the family business, a commitment I admired and supported wholeheartedly. However, as years passed, Bob's absences became the norm rather than the exception. He was hardly ever home, and the nights I spent waiting in our living room, kindly provided by his parents, grew longer and lonelier. "Guess he's not coming home tonight," became a silent mantra I repeated to myself, hope dwindling each time. Bob's rare appearances at home were fleeting. Most of his meals were eaten out due to late work hours and frequent business trips that took him away for days. Concerned about his health, I often wondered whether he was resting enough or eating well. One particular morning, as he prepared for another early departure, I found the courage to address the growing gap between us. "Bob, I wish you'd have a proper meal," I said, hoping to bridge the distance with something as simple yet intimate as a shared breakfast. His response was swift, a reflection of the pace of his life. "I just don't have the time, Sam. You know how it is with the new project ramping up." I nodded, the weight of unspoken words filling the room as he rushed out, leaving me with my thoughts and the quiet hum of the morning. Without even glancing my way as he adjusted his tie, Bob casually remarked, "It's fine, work's just really busy right now. Don't worry about it, Samantha." With those few words, he quickly left the house. Even on weekends, his pattern remained unchanged. He was away from early morning until late at night, whether it was a Saturday, Sunday, or holiday. The frequent business trips made it feel like I was living alone. At first, I wondered if Bob was deliberately trying to give me space by not being home too much. Perhaps, I thought, he might even be embarrassed by his absence. There were times I allowed myself to believe such gentle explanations for his behavior. Living this way, I realized I hardly knew Bob at all. His belongings in our home were minimal, just the bare essentials. We rarely talked, leaving me clueless about his hobbies, his favorite foods, or even his dislikes. Did I do something wrong? I often pondered, feeling a deep-seated uncertainty. I discussed these thoughts with my parents, but they dismissed them by saying it was normal for men to be busy with work. They didn't seem to take my concerns seriously. Even my few friends told me it was better to have a husband who was out working than one who was always home. They even envied me, they said, which only isolated my feelings further. While Bob handled our finances well, ensuring there was always enough for our monthly expenses, this lack of financial insecurity somehow deepened my worries. I blamed myself, thinking maybe I had done something to upset him. Was I lacking as a wife? I strived to be thorough in everything I did at home. I had even taken up cooking classes, hoping to prepare delicious meals for the brief times Bob was home. On the rare occasions he noticed my anxious expression, he would try to reassure me. "Samantha, you're doing just fine," he'd say, his words meant to comfort. I forced myself to accept this, thinking perhaps this was just how some marriages were meant to be. However, a call from my father-in-law at the end of the year shattered any complacency I had. It was unusual for him to call, and his voice was stern and loud when he did, causing me to drop the phone in shock. "Samantha, what on earth are you thinking?" he bellowed. Did something happen?" I stammered, genuinely confused. "Don't play dumb. Why aren't you attending the family gatherings?" "Every single year," he accused. I was stunned. This was the first I heard of any family gatherings. I had spoken to Bob about New Year greetings before. He had told me that on New Year's Day, students from the cooking school usually came to greet his parents, implying that the family didn't gather. He had even said that if there were a family gathering, it would be too crowded and unmanageable. It was always just Bob who visited his parents' home with New Year's gifts. The atmosphere was thick with tension and the chatter of relatives as I stood awkwardly amid the New Year's party of the Waters family. It was an elaborate affair, with a lot of relatives gathered, all exchanging greetings and laughter, seemingly a stark contrast to the cold treatment I was receiving. When I finally managed to join the gathering, my father-in-law greeted me with a stern, "At last you showed up. It's only natural for family to attend such events." I tried to explain. Bob told me there wasn't any family gathering, but his response was only more fury. "You've been avoiding us, because you didn't want to see us," he accused sharply. I felt the sting of his words deeply, unable to muster a response that could soothe his anger. The room seemed to grow colder as other family members also gave me unwelcoming looks. It was clear they had expected me all these years, and my absence had been noted and resented. I had come to the gathering hoping to mend bridges and perhaps integrate myself more into Bob's family life, but the reality was proving harsh. What I couldn't bear, however, was Bob's lack of support. Throughout the evening, he remained distant, merely sipping his beer quietly. He didn't intervene or come to my defense, leaving me to navigate the choppy waters of familial expectations alone. As the night progressed and more drinks were poured, the mood of the party lightened somewhat, and a few relatives started to approach me. Maybe it was the alcohol loosening their reservations, or perhaps curiosity getting the better of them, but they began to strike up conversations. While some were merely polite, others seemed genuinely interested in hearing my side of the story. I found myself engaging in discussions, explaining how Bob and I usually spend our New Year's and about my life as a housewife, which I had tried so hard to excel in. I discussed how I took care of our home meticulously and how I had enrolled in cooking classes to better prepare meals for Bob on the rare occasions he was home. I mentioned my previous job and my transition to being a housewife, which I had embraced fully despite the loneliness it often entailed. Throughout these conversations, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that I was finally connecting with Bob's family, and sadness at the realization of how much I had missed these past years. The distance that had formed between Bob and me seemed mirrored in my relationship with his family, a gap that had widened over time, filled with misunderstandings and assumptions. Though the evening was difficult, it was a revelation. I understood more clearly the importance of family gatherings and the expectations tied to them. It was a lesson in the complexities of family dynamics, especially within a traditional and closely knit family like Bob's. Despite the initial cold reception, I resolved to make more of an effort, not just for my own sake, but for the sake of maintaining peace and possibly finding a place within this family that seemed to hold its traditions and gatherings so dear. The following day, my curiosity intensified, fueling my resolve to continue observing Bob. As before, I followed him discreetly when he left for work in the morning. Ensuring I wasn't seen, I nestled into a corner at a different diner with a clear view of his office building. The day stretched long, with hours spent sipping coffee and pretending to be absorbed in my phone, all the while keeping an eye on the office entrance. Around 6 p.m., just as the evening began to settle in and the streets buzzed with people heading home, I saw Bob exit the building. He seemed in no hurry, casually checking his phone as he walked. This time, instead of heading straight back into the office or toward any usual business destinations, he took a different route. My heart raced a bit. This was the deviation I had been looking for. I followed at a safe distance, blending in with the evening crowd. Bob walked several blocks and then entered a cozy-looking restaurant that wasn't part of his usual stops, as far as I knew. I waited a few minutes before following him inside, taking care not to be seen. From a secluded spot near the back, I watched as Bob met with a woman. They greeted each other warmly, much more intimately than typical business colleagues would. The sight stung, and a flood of emotions washed over me. As they sat and talked, it was clear they were comfortable with each other, sharing laughs and what seemed like personal stories. I strained to catch snippets of their conversation, which seemed light and personal, not the serious tone of business meetings. They stayed there for over 2 hours, and all the while, I sat there trying to make sense of the scene before me. The evening grew darker, and eventually, they left the restaurant together. I felt a mix of dread and determination as I continued to follow them. They strolled through the streets, stopping occasionally to look at shop windows or to continue their conversation. The casual intimacy of their interaction was impossible to ignore. Finally, they parted ways with a long hug, and Bob headed back towards the direction of his office. I felt numb, the earlier excitement of my detective endeavor now replaced by a deep sadness and confusion. What was this relationship? Was it the reason for his constant absences, the strange lies about family gatherings, and the distant coldness at home? I continued to follow him until he disappeared into the subway. I didn't go back to the office to watch. Instead, I walked home slowly, lost in thought. When I arrived, the house felt emptier than usual, the silence echoing my troubled thoughts. Bob didn't come home until after midnight again, and by then, I had too many thoughts swirling in my head. The next morning, I decided I needed answers. It was time to confront Bob about everything I had witnessed and the growing distance between us. But first, I needed to gather my thoughts and plan exactly how to approach this delicate conversation. The uncertainty of what lay ahead was daunting, but I knew I couldn't continue living in the shadow of doubts and half-truths. As the end of the year drew near, the strain of my new, overcrowded life was palpable. With the New Year's gathering approaching, Bob predictably insisted that I should not attend. "You've got too much on your plate to waste time on gatherings," he said dismissively one morning as he was about to leave for work. I was already worn thin by the dual demands of full-time work and all the household chores, yet his words cut deep. It was as if he saw my efforts as trivial, my exhaustion inconsequential. Caught in the exhausting cycle of work and endless housework, I found myself trapped in a life I hadn't anticipated. Every morning, our brief encounters were filled with his criticisms. "The windows are dirty," he would remark as he grabbed his briefcase. "There's dust in the hallway, and you didn't iron my shirt properly." These snide comments left me scrambling to manage everything perfectly, despite my overwhelming fatigue. My return to the electronics company had been out of necessity rather than choice. Balancing this job with my responsibilities at home felt nearly impossible. The days blurred into one another, with work consuming my daylight hours and housework filling the evenings. The small hours of the morning were my only respite, yet they were tinged with a sense of failure and isolation. Bob's constant berating over every small imperfection in our home only added to the pressure, making each day more daunting than the last. With the New Year's gathering on the horizon, I was torn. Bob's stern prohibition felt more like a command than a suggestion, reflecting his ongoing efforts to control aspects of my life, including my social interactions. Yet, part of me longed to attend, to step away from the relentless routine and perhaps find a semblance of the community and family ties I once hoped to build with Bob's family. As the day of the gathering neared, I wrestled with the decision. The isolation at home, compounded by Bob's insistence that I stay away from the gathering, left me feeling disconnected not just from his family, but from a part of myself. I missed the sense of belonging, the shared laughter, and even the petty squabbles that defined family gatherings. More than that, I missed feeling like I was part of something larger than the confines of our home and the endless cycle of chores and work. Despite Bob's directive, I began to entertain the idea of defying him. What if I went to the gathering on my own? It would be a chance to reconnect, to assert some independence, and perhaps to remind both Bob and myself that I was more than just a beleaguered housewife and worker. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. As the day drew closer, my resolve strengthened. This New Year's, I decided, would be different. I would go to the gathering, face the family, and reclaim a part of my life that was slipping away under the weight of Bob's expectations and my own resignation. The decision felt like a small rebellion, a flicker of the person I used to be, someone who wouldn't have tolerated being diminished and dictated to like this. To boast about his achievements and how he was a good husband, insisting he provided well for the house and did his best to ensure everything was in order. His words were loud and full of confidence, clearly aimed at convincing not just his father, but the entire room. Meanwhile, I stood there, my own emotions churning as I listened to him paint a picture of our life that was so distant from the truth. I tightened my grip on the thick envelope I had brought with me, containing evidence of the countless evenings Bob hadn't come home, the numerous business trips that seemed more leisure than work, and other details that painted a very different picture of the man who now spoke so highly of his responsibilities and care. As the room buzzed with Bob's declarations, I found a moment of clarity amidst the turmoil. It wasn't just about proving something to his family or even to him, it was about standing up for myself and the truth of my lived experience in our marriage. Finally, I interrupted Bob's flow of self-praise. If you're such a dedicated husband, why is it that you're hardly ever home? Why is it that most nights, I eat alone? My voice was steady, stronger than I had felt in months. And these business trips, can you explain why I found receipts from places that have nothing to do with your work? I pulled out the receipts from the envelope, holding them up for the room to see. The room fell silent, the previous murmurings dying down as all eyes turned towards me. Bob's face went from confident to pale as he realized what I was showing everyone. His attempt to regain control was visible as he stammered, trying to formulate a response. That's not, they're just team-building exercises, he finally managed to say, but his voice lacked conviction. I continued, my resolve firming. Team building? At midnight? And why would you lie about the family gatherings, telling me they were too crowded and that I shouldn't bother attending? The question seemed to echo in the room, giving weight to my words. Bob looked desperately towards his father, hoping for some support, but the older man's expression was unreadable. Slowly, murmurs began amongst the relatives, their previous cold gazes now mixed with confusion and curiosity about the truth. Seeing the shift in the room, I felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps now, they would see the reality of what I had been enduring, not the distorted version Bob had always presented. My father-in-law, still looking shocked, finally addressed Bob directly. Bob, we need to talk about this, he said in a stern tone, motioning him away from the crowd. Not here, not now. As they walked away, I remained standing, the envelope still in my hand, filled with mixed emotions. On one hand, I was drained from the confrontation, but on the other, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. I had spoken up, not just for myself, but for the necessity of honesty in our family dynamic. Whatever the outcome, I knew that I had begun to change the narrative, one that would hopefully lead to more honest and open relationships within the family. I continued our confrontation. The tension in the room was palpable as relatives shuffled uncomfortably, their earlier stern glares turning into expressions of concern and curiosity. As I stood there, documents in hand, it was clear that the dynamics within the room were shifting. Bob, I said firmly, my voice carrying across the room, how can you deny all this? These aren't just random pictures, they tell a story you've been hiding from everyone. Bob, now visibly sweating under the scrutiny of his family and the damning evidence laid out before him, stuttered in his responses. I can explain, he attempted weakly, but his voice trailed off as he looked around at the assembled faces, all awaiting his explanation. My father-in-law, holding the photographs, looked up from them to Bob with a serious expression. Son, these aren't just simple accusations. These are serious claims, backed by evidence. You owe us all an explanation, he said, his tone indicating his disappointment and the seriousness of the situation. Bob looked at me then, his expression one of betrayal, not because of what I had uncovered, but because I had brought it to light in front of his family. He tried to compose himself, his usual confidence slipping away as he addressed the room. Look, I've been under a lot of stress at work. It's not what it looks like, Bob began, his voice faltering. But as he spoke, it was clear his excuses sounded hollow, even to his own ears. I cut him off, no longer willing to let him weave more lies. Stress from work? So, you relieve stress by spending nights out, not just working late, but with someone who clearly isn't your wife? My voice was sharp, my frustration and hurt fueling my words. The room was silent, everyone's eyes shifting between Bob and me. My mother-in-law, who had been silent up to this point, finally spoke, her voice filled with sadness and disbelief. Bob, if these things are true, why didn't you just talk to us? To Samantha? She gestured towards me with a pained expression. Bob's defense began to crumble as the reality of his deception began to sink in, not only for him, but for everyone present. His attempts to maintain his facade were failing, and with each failed excuse, his image within the family was tarnishing further. As he struggled to respond, I felt a mix of vindication and profound sadness. This was not how I had envisioned confronting the issues in our marriage, nor had I wanted to expose them in such a public and dramatic way. But the years of loneliness, frustration, and betrayal had brought me to this breaking point. Everyone, I didn't want it to come to this, I addressed the room, my voice steadier now. But I couldn't continue living a lie, pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. This isn't just about his infidelity, it's about respect, trust, and honesty, which are supposed to be the foundation of any marriage. As I finished speaking, the room remained silent, the weight of the moment settling on all of us. Bob, now devoid of his usual bravado, looked smaller somehow, his eyes avoiding mine. The confrontation had laid bare the reality of our marriage, and from this point on, everything would change. As the stark reality of Bob's intentions dawned on me, I stood there, feeling the weight of every word he confessed. It was almost too much to process that the person I had lived with, trusted, and cared for had orchestrated such a deceitful plan just to maintain a facade for his family and himself. Bob continued, his voice growing fainter as he faced the gathered family. I always felt pressured to marry, to meet some societal standard of being a real man. Once married, I thought I could just manage the appearances and continue my life as I wanted. Samantha, I dragged you into this under false pretenses, thinking I could keep my life separate and hidden. I never expected to get caught or to actually develop any real feelings. The room was heavy with a mix of emotions, shock, anger, and disappointment. My mother-in-law, who had initially been stern, now showed signs of sorrow, her earlier fury melting into sadness at the unraveling of her son's character. Bob, how could you? She whispered, more to herself than to him. All this time, all these years, you've been living a lie at the expense of someone else's happiness. The relatives, previously murmuring among themselves, were now silent, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and disapproval. I could see them reevaluating their perceptions of Bob, the situation, and perhaps the implications for our entire family. Feeling a surge of resolve amidst the chaos of emotions, I addressed Bob directly, trying to keep my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Bob, why did you go so far as to malign me to everyone? Was it just to make yourself feel justified in your actions? To make it easier to blame me for a failed marriage? Bob looked up, his eyes meeting mine for a brief moment before looking away, unable to sustain the gaze. I thought if I set things up right, I wouldn't have to deal with any backlash when I finally left, he admitted, his voice a mix of resignation and defeat. I didn't consider how deeply it would hurt you or what it would do to our families. As he spoke, I realized the full extent of the situation. This wasn't just about a broken marriage, it was about shattered trust and the ripple effects it would have on everyone connected to us. The documents in my hand, the evidence of his deceit, felt heavier than ever. They were not just papers, they were the manifestation of the betrayal that had colored our entire relationship. I turned to the family, who were all looking to me, then to Bob, then back to me, as if trying to find some clue on how to react. "I came here today not to cause a scene or seek revenge," I began, my voice firmer now, empowered by the truth. "I came to show that I am not the person Bob has portrayed. I've been truthful and faithful in our relationship, despite what you have been led to believe." The room remained silent, the tension palpable. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see how the family matriarch and patriarch would respond to this unraveling drama that had disrupted what should have been a festive family gathering. The relationship I developed with Bob's parents after the ordeal, especially his mother-in-law, became one of unexpected warmth and mutual respect. Despite the harsh truths and the tumultuous times that led to the unraveling of my marriage with Bob, his parents showed a level of dignity and integrity that was profoundly reassuring. It was clear that they were devastated by Bob's actions, not just because of the betrayal of trust, but also because of the pain inflicted upon someone they had come to regard as family, me. In the aftermath of the divorce, life settled into a new rhythm. The apartment that Bob's parents had provided for us to live in as a married couple became solely mine. Living there without Bob, I found a sense of peace and freedom that had been missing for years. The space felt different, liberated from the tensions and shadows of a marriage based on deceit. I began to redecorate, making the place truly my own, erasing the remnants of Bob's presence to create a sanctuary for myself. Bob's downfall continued outside the confines of our failed marriage. His professional life suffered as his personal misdeeds came to light, leading to a demotion and a significant decrease in his financial status. His mistress, perhaps attracted to what she thought was a stable and lucrative connection, left him once the reality of his new circumstances became clear. This information, though passed along through his mother-in-law during one of our occasional catch-ups, was not something I took pleasure in. It was merely a confirmation that the truth tends to reveal itself, often with rigorous consequences. Despite the invitation to join the Waters family for their New Year gatherings, I chose to decline. The memories associated with those events were still too fresh, too entangled with the emotional upheaval of the past. Instead, I focused on traveling and enjoying life's luxuries, something I had never imagined doing so freely before. These trips abroad, funded partly by the generous financial support from Bob's family, which I suspected was their way of compensating for the turmoil, were my way of reclaiming joy and adventure for myself. The stable income from my job, which I had returned to thanks to Bob's one constructive suggestion during our marriage, ensured that I would not face financial difficulties. It was a stark contrast to the life I had envisioned as a housewife, dependent and secluded from the broader world. Maintaining a relationship with Bob's father and occasionally speaking with other family members, I found a sort of familial bond that was based not on marriage, but on shared experiences and mutual respect. They had shown me that despite Bob's failings, the foundation of their family was built on strong moral values and support. As I continued to build a new life, free from the shadows of my marriage to Bob, I often reflected on the journey that brought me to this point. It was a mixture of unexpected trials and equally unexpected alliances. In the end, the freedom and the peace I found in independence were the truest forms of closure and healing.